So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar this morning on the topic of the impact of malnutrition on infants and children. An important topic, obviously, it goes without saying, and maybe one that is quite often overlooked while we all focus on the so-called big things like ESCOM and state capture and politics and all of those things. We have a tendency to forget the most vulnerable sectors in society. And I think that the whole area of infant malnutrition falls under the heading of vulnerable, highly vulnerable. So it's good that we tackle this issue. Thank you for joining us. Chantal, can I ask you to, thank you, switch on your video. And
thank you very much, Mike.
Then to hand directly over to you without any further ado. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to open up my slides. Please tell me if you are able to see the slides and if it's on slideshow.
Yes, we can see it, and there you are on slideshow, yes.
So good morning, everybody, and a very special thank you to Lois for inviting me to make this presentation. As explained, I am based at the University of the Western Cape in terms of the project that I'm leading, but I'm physically based in Bloemfontein. So I'm greeting you from a hotel room. So if there is a little bit of noise, I think around about 10:30, 11 o'clock, they start vacuuming. So please bear with me. I hope that the presentation will flow smoothly. And I know that Nzama is not yet on time, so I'm not going to rush through my presentation. I was told that I have 20 minutes and I will use the 20 minutes, excluding the questions. So I hope there'll be time for questions. So I thought I would address this topic of slow violence of child malnutrition. And this comes from a publication from the University of Cape Town, which launches the Child Gauge every year. And the Child Gauge 2020, just as COVID had hit us, was focused on child malnutrition. I also thought that it's appropriate that while the government is holding a huge meeting on gender-based violence, that we remember that food insecurity is violence. Also in the context of personal violence, withholding food is violence. But I'm speaking particularly from a perspective of this ongoing child malnutrition. And I'm going to unpack what are we talking about when we say child malnutrition and what are the implications? So I want to outline my presentation. I'm going to give a landscape analysis of COVID and how it has impacted child malnutrition and what is the context that we're talking from. We know that there was lockdown measures and what those lockdown measures has had on households. But that is extending the shocks beyond COVID. We are now talking about global shocks. We're talking about the price of food because of fuel increases. We're talking about price of food because of the cost of moving food across a globe that was virtually locked down for 2 years. There are policy gaps. In preparation for this talk, I really thought one of the things that I want to come away from my webinars and my presentations is that we need to start talking about solutions. While we know how big the problem is and what we know what we must do, we don't always have the solutions. And I think that's very demoralizing for a country, a community, a household. They know there is a problem, but if somebody is not stepping up with a set of solutions, it's very disempowering. And so I want to put down a few proposed interventions, and maybe in the discussion and in the question time, we can talk about what is the feasibility of these interventions and what kind of resources do we need to mobilize, meaning people as well as financial resources to try and address the food insecurity in our country. So we know that COVID has hit. The newspapers have been carrying these very dire headlines about people who are going without food, children who are dying because they don't have food. And I saw last week the Daily Maverick focused again on food because of the budget speech. And the budget speech had a very dismal outlook on social grants. And those social grants actually support 12 million households in South Africa. And so what does it mean? It means that when we have an economic crisis as we're currently having, and we don't have the safety nets like the child support grant, that households cannot purchase food. Why? Because South Africa is not a subsistence farming kind of country. If you look at the rest of Africa and the rest of middle income countries, a large proportion of those households can actually grow their own food. But that's not the case in South Africa. In South Africa, 89% of households are buying their food. They are purchasing, which means economic access is a very big bottleneck for people to eat well. So we have roughly about 6.5 million people who are without food, and I'm using only national data. I'm not using the COVID surveys because the COVID surveys were done in a time that was very, there was a lot of upheaval. But on average in South Africa, we have about just under 10 million people that need food support. When I say food support, I mean they need an intervention where food is provided to them. Many of us are aware of food being flown into countries like the war-torn countries or disaster countries where UNICEF and WFP, the World Food Programme, fly in and deliver food. This is what we're talking about. Food safety nets. 6.5 million people back in 2017 needed a food safety net, meaning food needed to be delivered to them in one way or another. Since then, we've had our unemployment rates increasing again. This is 2019 data because the COVID was a huge shock. And so we know that we are close up to 1 in 3 people being unemployed in South Africa, which has a knock-on effect because those people support other people in their households. So it's not just the unemployment of a third of our population, it's a third who support another 5 people. So there's a huge number of people that are going without food because of our unemployment rates. We also have a large proportion of our households. The data from 2021 shows that now it's 55% of households are dependent on social grants. Those include the social relief grant that came out with COVID. And we're very grateful that the government has extended the COVID grant until 2024, because this is a safety net. This is a dire need to provide food in households. Year on year, we've seen that the food price has gone up. There's a very stark picture that shows what could be bought for the 350 grant in 2020 and what it can buy now in 2022. And it's lost about a third of the food because the prices have gone up. And you would have noted on my opening slide that my project is particularly around infant and young child feeding. And when it comes to infant and young child feeding, breastfeeding is a food source. It is food security. It is not just about bonding with mothers and mothers feel happy when their child is being breastfed. In our country, breastfeeding is a survival strategy. If children do not get breast milk and they get infant formula in suboptimal conditions, meaning dirty water, dirty utensils, unhygienic home environments, the bacterial count in that formula far outweighs the nutritional value of that formula, and therefore children die. So 1/3 of children in South Africa die because they are severely malnourished. And the underlying cause is because of poor breastfeeding. And I will come back to that, because if we are going to support healthy child development in South Africa, we need to address the low breastfeeding rates. I wanted to start this by saying that we have made many commitments to child food and nutrition. So it's not a moral obligation, it's actually a legal binding obligation that our country has signed up to. Our country is also a signatory to the United Nations, and the United Nations have put forward a set of targets, nutrition targets, that we need to meet as a country by 2025. And our country has set up these policies that talk to these targets. So right from the Bill of Rights that's in our Constitution, the right to basic nutrition for children is enshrined in the Constitution in section 128, 1A to C, talks about what children need. And so we build our policies around the fact that it is a legal obligation to support children's adequate growth and development. And we are not seeing that because South Africa has this long-standing malnutrition. So when we look across the country, not only are we just talking about children in South Africa, but this is a global issue. It's a global issue because the whole world is in a state of food shortages because there's not enough good food at household level. Good food is being replaced by highly processed cheap food that is fueling the obesity epidemic. We also know that our children are not getting access to support for mothers to care for them. So mothers who are working and mothers who are putting children in places of safety, like the early childhood development programs, like places of care, that food is not adequate. And so we see that in South Africa, our rates are very similar to the global middle income, we call it low middle income countries. 15% of our infants are born with low birth weight. That means children who are born under 2.5 kilograms. And if you are born with low birth weight, you have a whole myriad of conditions that will follow you for a lifetime. So children who have low birth weight are predisposed to chronic conditions like obesity. They are predisposed to chronic diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So it's in our interest to actually support maternal nutrition so that we don't have children being born prematurely, and we don't have children being born with a low birth weight or are small for gestational age. Chronic malnutrition is also measured by stunting. Now, what does stunting mean? Stunting means when you are too short for your age, and that indicates a very low level of good nutrition, meaning you're not getting enough energies. There's too little energy, so you are small in stature, or you're not getting a good enough micronutrient profile, and therefore your disease profile is higher. And we know that, again, children not reaching their full development also means that they have brain and cognitive, let's call them inefficiencies. So they're not growing to their full potential. And what this means is that at a country level, we're talking about poor health and well-being from childhood all the way to adulthood. We talk about increased disease susceptibility. That means you are predisposed to disease already from the time that you are in utero in your mother, and therefore your health outcomes are going to be worse. And we talk about the cycle of malnutrition and poverty. If you are malnourished, you can't work well. And there are many studies that show women. I think Sukiswa's mic is on. If it can just be turned off, thank you. So I think what we must remember is that we are talking about individual child health, but I'm talking to expanding it to what we are looking at as a country. So when you have a malnourished population, you have an unproductive or inefficient productivity that happens in that population, and therefore you are trapped in poverty. So we are now labeled as a upper middle income country, but with our poverty levels, with our malnutrition levels, we very much will drop down the economic development, will drop down the human development index because of child malnutrition. And these are policy level indicators that have an effect on all of us. We must also remember, I always talk about, we are now the aging population. So if we are going to be the aging population, we need a productive young population that's going to step into that economic development sector for us, if we're going to still stay an upper middle income country. But if we're not investing in children, we can't expect to have a high functioning productive population in the future. And our indicators are showing that we are not doing well on those set of indicators. So this is the framework that we use globally. It's to explain malnutrition and where do we need to intervene. So malnutrition is an outcome. It's an outcome of inadequate dietary intake, which means that the food is inadequate both in quality and in quantity. So if you're not having enough food, you won't have enough energy, you can't grow well, therefore the brain is compromised. If you're malnourished, you have higher susceptibility to disease. And we see this very clearly with children. If children are malnourished, they have more susceptibility to diarrhea. They have more incidence of diarrhea. The more diarrhea you have, the more nutrition you're losing. Our children are highly susceptible to upper respiratory tract infections. And so children dying from pneumonia is also because they have an underlying cause of malnutrition. And then finally, you can die because you don't have enough nutrition. either by deficiencies. You die because you're anemic, you die because you don't have enough vitamin A, and you don't have enough immunity to fight diseases. Below that, that means we need to look at the food access. This is the food system. How do we grow the food? How do we provide the food? We talk about from farm to fork. Everything that influences the food production system will impact what we take in and will impact what is the outcome. This middle section is called inadequate care for children and women, but particularly women. If women are not supported, they cannot provide for their children adequately. If women are not educated, that means they don't get enough jobs to be able to earn their money to feed their children. If women don't get enough support in the workplace to breastfeed, they won't have the time to breastfeed their children. They'll put their children into daycare centers where they are not being cared for adequately, and that fuels our malnutrition. So these are systems that protect women. In a country that has such high gender-based violence, high unemployment, high inequity, then we know our women are not having the capacity to actually care for their children because the system is not caring for women. Women and mothers in particularly are the safety environment for children. If women aren't cared for, then our children aren't cared for. And this is something that we must really unpack because it has an impact on children and children's health. Inefficient health services and health environments. Apologies. If our health services can't address the diseases, if we don't have enough services like we saw with COVID, if the health service is failing us, the disease will overtake and cause more death. So the outcome there would be really death. So inefficient health services, inefficient healthcare providers, inefficient healthcare competencies completely underline how we manage diseases. And in the nutritional setting, this is really important because it also talks about services like immunization. If children are not vaccinated, they're more likely to get disease and therefore affect their nutrition. If children are not attending our well baby clinics to have growth monitoring, we can't identify and intervene timeously so that they don't become the malnourished children we find in hospitals. And in South Africa right now, around about 12,000 children die because of severe acute malnutrition, and that's got directly related to, again, how can the health services help? All underlining this are what we call our basic causes. And these basic causes for South Africa are really rooted in poor governance, poor political environment, and definitely poor management of resources. And I don't think I need to talk to you about the corruption that filters up and affects how much food actually lands on a child's plate when the system is not able to control state, let's call it misappropriation of resources. And then you have budget cuts, like we had recently with only a 2% increase for social grants. And those social grants actually support and have a better outcome for children. But without adequate resources, we won't be able to provide that to children. So why is this so important for us in terms of the generational gap or the generational cycle of malnutrition? So here you have three, let's call them 3 generations. So for a woman who's carrying a baby, her baby is exposed to her nutritional status. If she has poor nutritional status, if she's overweight, if she's micronutrient deficient, that's what the baby is exposed to. In the girl child, her ovum are already developed as an infant, and in her mother's womb, this is the baby, this is the mother of the baby, but this actually makes this the grandmother of this future child. So this malnutrition state that this baby is exposed to then predisposes her to her malnourished state. And you can see here, this woman is now obese because she has been exposed to an obesogenic environment. We call this epigenetics. Your food actually programs your genes and can result in you carrying a disease profile. We all know that diabetes is hereditary, cardiovascular disease is hereditary, but it's got to do with our epigenetics and our food environment. So more than just your genes being bad genes. Bad food leads to bad genes. And this little ovum has now become the next infant. And so this infant is now again exposed to poor environment. This is why we have to improve maternal nutrition, because for maternal nutrition to have a good impact on this baby, not to be premature, born premature, not to be born low birth weight, and not to be born with predisposing conditions, we need to fix maternal nutrition. I hope that explains this very highly sophisticated concept when we talk about the origins of disease and health. So this is called DOHAD, the development of the origins of disease and health. And this is important because it talks directly to maternal nutrition. And if we have no maternal nutrition programs running, it means the future of children is compromised. So way before COVID, and more especially now in terms of our global impact, as I said, the fuel prices, the food prices, the impact of climate change, all of these are exacerbating the poor nutritional status we already had. So South Africa is coming from a history of poor nutrition, and the data is not improving. I've just listed some of the data that we have here. So maternal obesity, 1 in 3 women, that's 33% of women are already obese when they are pregnant. We have anemia, which means mothers, 1 in 3 women are already anemic, which will affect the developing fetus. And both of these lead to these poor outcomes: prematurity in births, low birth weight, and we've seen that 15% of our children are born with low birth weight, and the cycle is continuing. So it starts with the maternal nutrition there. The area that I'm working on and focusing a lot on is how do we fix this problem? One of the best evidence-based interventions is to support breastfeeding. If we don't support breastfeeding, we just perpetuate this poor nutrition all the way along the life course. And the life course is from birth. And here, we talk about, for these 2 areas, we talk about the first 1,000 days. And I think some of you might have attended the Grow Great seminar yesterday. The first 1,000 days speak to 9 months of pregnancy and the first 2 years of life. If we cannot change the nutritional status in those first 2 years, brain development and brain cognitive development is compromised. And South Africa has been running for a very long time with very low exclusive breastfeeding rates, only 8% in 2008. We saw a huge jump in 2016. And the reason we saw this jump is because you will remember that South Africa used to give free formula in the program for the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. And so for 10 years, between 2011 to 2021, 2001 to 2011, for those 10 years, we were giving free formula. So South Africa became a country that was very, had a pro-formula environment. In 2011, the then Minister of Health, Dr. Arden Motsoaledi, committed South Africa to become a breastfeeding country and put in place a number of strategies and a number of policies. And those policies have paid off because we saw that there was an increase in 2016. The WHO nutrition target for all countries is to have exclusive breastfeeding rates, which means breast milk and nothing else, giving the baby nothing but breast milk, is supposed to be 50% by 2025. We are now almost just 2 years away from 2025, and we are still hovering around 1 in 3 children when we want to move towards the 50%. As I said, our stunting levels have always been high. In 2016, we were close to 1 in 3 children also being stunted. That means they are too short for their age, and that stunting is related to brain development. And if you are stunted in growth, you are stunted in cognitive development. The physical brain is also not well developed, not well architectured, and it has an impact on your learning ability. And I've obviously spoken about obesity. So what are we talking about when we talk about these global shocks? It's not surprising. We have decreased access to food because there's not enough money to buy enough food. We have higher levels of hunger. We saw the levels of hunger go exponentially up during COVID, and that was because there were the lockdown measures. People couldn't work, people couldn't buy food, and certainly shops were closed. So there were many households that ran without food because there was no access to food. The relief package and the relief services that we have in place are not at scale. That means it's not reaching the 6 million people that need it. It's also low in nutrient content. We see that all the food baskets that are provided is high in starchy foods, very low in good quality proteins like eggs, milk, fish, meat. We also see that there's not enough fresh fruits and vegetables, not enough beans, legumes, soya. So it's very high in starch, which is not good quality foods when you're wanting to feed children. And then we've seen an increase in acute malnutrition over time. We've seen articles where children are dying, particularly in the Eastern Cape, made the headlines. My own province, Free State, our MEC for Health had to come out publicly and say we are not coping. Children are dying in our hospitals and the hospitals can't fix them because the hospitals are short-term. What we need is safety nets in the communities, and the community safety nets are not in place. And therefore, again, health services underplay that because we need health services to support all these interventions. I'm going to skip this because that was about mortality. I'm not going to talk about mortality. I want to talk about where are we and where do we focus. So during COVID, we had a lot of focus in this triangle, food availability. We saw that there was many good initiatives such as the community action networks that started up in the Western Cape and moved into Gauteng. And then I've seen a few places in the Eastern Cape also using community action networks for food, supporting food provision, like our food kitchens, like our early childhood development centers. We've seen the churches and faith-based organizations coming together, and it was a wonderful experience during a crunch time like COVID. What we are not seeing is an extension of that into normal everyday support right now when people are compromised because they don't have enough money. We really need to understand, how do we support these immediate food drives? I don't think we can do this without bringing big business to the table. We cannot be talking to ourselves as NGOs in academia. We are measuring the problem. We know how big the problem is, but we need to bring resources and thinking around this, a systems thinking. And we need big business to play a part because they are making profits while children are dying. And while this is happening, we also need to keep the nutrition's bigger triangle in mind. That means in the long term, child nutrition food services must be of good quality, must be of good quantity, and it must support the interventions that we say are life-saving for children. Otherwise, we're perpetuating the cycle of malnutrition, which is again fed, as I said, by poverty and poor services. Let me jump now to the brain, because this is, I think, for many people that come to these webinars, many of you are not coming from a nutrition background, but are coming from a programming background, either in child programs or community programs. The concept of child brain development is not just about whether children can make the matric results or not make the matric results. Brains are also the level of emotional feeling. So we use that expression, a hungry man is an angry man. We can extrapolate that to a hungry nation is an angry nation. So cognitive investments for brain development, which are actually nutrition investments, are not only just for this ability to learn and get better jobs and get better income into households, but it's also about higher cognitive functioning so that we can engage at a very high level in the economic development of a country. All the IT jobs, all the science-driven jobs, all the fourth industrial revolution that we are facing now as a globe will need cognitive skills and competencies. You cannot do that if your brain is not developed, if your brain is compromised. And so we need to be investing in brain development, and those come back to the nutrition programs. I have just come back from a very exciting conference that was held in Panama. It is the International Society for Research in Human Milk and Lactation. And so this set of slides that I'm using now is hot off the press for a project that's called Begin, which is looking at breastfeeding and the genetic improvements for nutrition. And it's all about breast milk, a live organism and a biological system that supports child optimal child development. So when we talk about breast milk, it's not just for nourishment. We know that children that breastfeed well grow well, and they grow well without becoming obese or overweight. Our evidence shows us that formula feeding is directly related to the obesogenic profile of children, because the human milk is much less in sugars and fats, where you have the formulated milk, which is not a replica of breast milk. This is one of the fallacies that we must address head on. Formula does not equal breast milk and will never be able to equal breast milk. And we need to start encouraging our women everywhere, anywhere, to start breastfeeding. In the milk, there are many neurotranslators that send signals to the baby, from the baby to the mother. A big area of interest now is called the microbiome of your gut. Your gut is your second brain. And the development of that microbiome starts with breast milk. Breast milk is a live organism. So the immunoglobulins that are in the mother get transferred to the baby through breast milk. It cannot be done through formula. Many of the interventions that formula claims to be doing is a minutiae towards what breast milk has. So breast milk has something like 4,000 to 6,000 elements that talk to the gut and develop the gut for the future of that infant. So if the gut is being fed only one type of food, and in this case, it is formulated milk from cows, it does not have the same microbiome as a mother who's feeding her baby. Some very interesting research has shown that when the baby needs certain elements, let's say the baby has a fever, and the baby sends that message by drinking on the breast, microbes move from the child's mouth in its saliva through the nipple of the mother, sends that message back to the mother's brain, and the mother starts to make these microbiomes and microbes that go back to the baby. So this is a very unique biological system that cannot be replicated in a test tube or in a bottle or a tin, because every mother and her baby have a unique breast milk composition made up. So just to remind everybody, what are the guidelines? We talk about exclusive breastfeeding for the first 6 months. That means breast milk and nothing else but breast milk. We talk about only introducing foods at 6 months and nothing before 6 months. You either feed your baby a breastfeeding or a formula feeding. During the HIV, we learned this concept of mixed feeding that is very bad for babies. And that mixed feeding was related to the fact that you could transmit HIV through your breast milk. And if you were formula feeding, your baby's gut did not have the integrity. So we would try to reduce mixed feeding to protect babies from being exposed to HIV. But in the context of healthy mothers and babies, we would like our mothers to breastfeed as much as they can. We know there is a need for formula because mothers are working or they're away from their children. But if your mother is still breastfeeding, that child has a better chance of having a better nutritional outcome. We should be breastfeeding up to 2 years. Yesterday, I had a very detailed and heated conversation with somebody who said, but mothers can't breastfeed up to 2 years. Yes, they can. They can if they are protected through maternity protection. They can if their children are with them. They can if we have a pro-breastfeeding environment. The pro-breastfeeding environment that we see in the Scandinavian countries are not because those women are different to African women. African women are not protected in their workplace and they're not protected in their communities. Since 2015, I did my PhD in breastfeeding and looked at the barriers to breastfeeding. Since 2015 to 2020, every newspaper carried at least one article where a mother was shamed for breastfeeding. She was put out of restaurants because she was breastfeeding. She was put off an airline because she was breastfeeding. She was asked to go and feed behind a curtain in a health facility, a private health facility. And that means that we are not a pro-breastfeeding country. I know that I'm talking to a congregation that belongs to churches. If our churches are not breastfeeding friendly, we tell moms that they have to go outside to breastfeed or they have to sit in their cars to breastfeed. We need to start in our own environments and start creating this breastfeeding culture that we need. I want to show you this data because this is data from 2016. It's the most recent and the last data that we have for breastfeeding. This blue line is exclusive breastfeeding. And I want to see that mothers start with exclusive breastfeeding very low in South Africa. We only have about 44% of our mothers starting by only giving breast milk. But by 2 months, it drops down to 24%. It's almost a 50% drop. And the reason there is a 50% drop here is because, one, we have habits of introducing water to our babies, giving sugar water to babies, giving babies water with gripe water. And so this decreases our exclusive breastfeeding rates. Also, when moms start preparing to go back to work, which is usually around the 3-month mark, we see that the introduction of formula is increased. And there you see no breastfeeding at all. This is the formula feeding line. Because our mothers can't afford adequate amounts of formula, formula is very expensive. You think of a 200 Rand tin against your child support grant, which is 480 Rand. You can't buy 4 tins. You buy 1 tin and you dilute it. And you dilute it to the point that it's not a nutritional food anymore. And so this line explains why we see so much severe acute malnutrition in our younger age group, but it also talks about why we see chronic stunting because there's not enough nutrition in the diet. Complementary feeding. I said that we should have no foods be fed before 6 months. But if you look at this line, you see how the complementary, this means when we start giving our babies those cereals in the bottle, adding food to the child's diet because you can't afford the formula, so you start giving food. This is the line that explains why we see an increase in diabetes, hypertension, and obesity in children. So the profile of our children and their feeding practices is dismal in South Africa. So the double burden really talks about the cost of ill health and premature death, and we are paying because we are not investing in good nutrition programs for children. And good nutrition programs, as I said, starts with maternal nutrition and then talks directly to those breastfeeding indicators that I used. So what can we do as a community and what should we be doing? As a community, we should all be supporting the call for the universal basic income grant. The Black Sash has done an economic calculation about what it would take to have a universal income grant. We can have a universal income grant if there's a demand for it. That means NGOs need to start talking about this. We cannot talk in silos about safety nets and social protection in South Africa. With our high rates of unemployment, our high rates of food insecurity, we need a basic universal income grant. From the food perspective, I think unless we talk about macroeconomic food policies to control the prices of food in South Africa, we are going to just see less and less quality foods reaching households, and particularly those households that need it the most. The child support grant does not buy an adequate diet, not for the mother and not for the child. And it is not a grant that is solely spent on food. It is a grant that is spent on buying electricity, buying clothes, paying for education, paying for transport, and paying loan sharks. Women who are living on the grant are making loans because they can't make ends meet, and it's a reality we need to face. And therefore, a controlled, subsidized food basket makes sense. We have to strengthen and scale up these infant and young child feeding programs that I was talking about. Unless we fix breastfeeding, we cannot be addressing child obesity. We won't be able to address childhood obesity. And if we don't protect women with maternity, we can't talk about healthy outcomes for children or for women. And then at the household level, I think we can start doing intensified household food production. That means every little space, whether that is a hanging garden, a tire garden, a doored garden, people need to start producing food to supplement their meals so that they have a source of good, fresh fruits and vegetables coming into the diet. Because it's becoming too expensive to actually buy it. So if you can free up some of your money by producing your own foods, you will have more money to spend on your food basket. And then we cannot ignore that South Africa has never invested in a national nutrition literacy program. And I was very happy to engage with my colleague from HEALA because HEALA's been piloting a nutrition literacy program. And the uptake of that and how that is translating into how people are making better choices, I think gives us some guidance about what we can do through the faith-based organizations, through NGOs. You need to put nutrition central to your development programs because nutrition is central to development. If you are food insecure, you are not thinking, you can't think because you are in survival mode just to get food onto your table. So if we can support our households and our communities in terms of how they may access food in very evidence-based ways, very tried and tested ways, we will start to make a dent, particularly when people don't need to spend money and can actually generate that food for themselves. I think I've come to the end of my presentation. These are the references. I'm more than happy to share the presentation and certainly more than happy to share the references as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chantal. That was really an excellent presentation. Very worrying in many ways, but at least when we have access to the facts, then we know what we can start to do to deal with them. So thank you for that. I'm happy to say that Nzama Mbalati has managed to join us. Nzama,
that's fantastic.
You want to switch on your video and your sound? That's great. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm so sorry about a little bit of background noise.
No, that's fine. We heard that you had the misfortune to have your laptop stolen.
Yes.
So very glad that you were able to join us anyway. So Nzama is, as I said earlier, the project manager for the Healthy Living Alliance. Nzama, I'm going to hand straight over to you for your presentation, and then when that's finished, we'll open up to everyone for the discussion. So you can go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I'll be very brief, and if it's fine, I can switch off the video. I just wanted everyone to just first see me and then just talk on there, if that's okay.
Well, we're recording this, so it would be good if you can keep your video on.
No, that's okay. I can keep it.
Right.
So I think it's so difficult to speak. Thank you for the opportunity and for this very interesting webinar to talk about the first 1,000 days of children. And I think it's so difficult to talk after Chantal because number one, let me also call Dr. Chantal because number one, I was still saying Dr. Chantal has done a wonderful presentation, and I think it's so difficult to speak after her. So I'll be very brief so that we can have more time for discussions and deliberation on how. I think for me, the biggest issue is with all this picture that has actually been portrayed, and the current situation, which is really serious and worrying. How do we then advocate for to reverse or to turn this tide? It's a very big, bad, and an ugly picture. So how do we then actually build the solidarity, but also the movement to address and articulate to the issues at hand? And I think I want to speak from the Bill of Rights. For me, the first thing is that, the Constitution guarantees that everyone in Chapter 27, everyone has a right to access to food. And it say in particular, adequate food. And I think one of the things that I've been asking my comrades who are legal practitioners is like, what is adequate food? And I think they said, well, you guys as advocates and activists, you need to actually test what is adequate food. So why don't we launch a court case? Why don't we litigate, and why don't we actually push the boundaries in terms of what is healthy food? So I think that's number one in terms of where I wanted to start. But secondly, most importantly, is the Constitution when it comes to children. So if you look at adults, the Constitution says the government has to take reasonable steps and make sure that the right to food is progressive, right? There is a progressive realization. But when it comes to children, the right to access to nutrition is unlimited. The Constitution says every child should have access to shelter, nutrition, and education, without quantifying, what the state can't and can do. And I think we have a huge leverage because to make the Constitution a living document. So one of the things that HELA is doing is in terms of the food justice program, which Dr. Chantel, which I've spoken to Lois about, is we want to build a solidarity movement that is looking at addressing the issue of the right to food and the food injustices. And I think we have agreed that we're putting the child as the center. And I think Dr. Chantel has spoken about this, that we need to put the child at the center of the right to food. And I think there is another thing that I wanted to speak about in the few minutes of my wrapping up, and that is we need to draw the parallel because this country have the history of struggles. So some of us are coming from the HIV and health activism and movements, such as Treatment Action Campaign. And one of the things is that in as much as is the role and the obligation of the state to realize, right to food to children and actually to address stunting, obesity, and severe acute malnutrition among children in the first 1,000 days, is that we need to draw the parallel in terms of the commodity in terms of this access, because we all agree that the state has to actually ensure that children are not dying of severe acute malnutrition. We don't have a 20% stunting, which has been stubborn for a very long time. We don't have children who are obese. But again, they are the economic determinants of health. Which I think it's important that, because food itself is a commodity. And when I drew the parallel in terms of most of the activists that are coming from the HIV field, what has been to say, it is important that we look at these companies, right? So Dr. Chantel was talking about breastfeeding and the challenges of the low rates in breastfeeding that we have. So one of the things that I think it's critical is, how do we tackle the big food? So your Nestle, your Nido, and other big food companies that are actually, shaping, this narrative, and who are actually perpetuating the problem that we are dealing with. So, and when I spoke to the activists the other time, we're having a training for the coalition members of HELA, I was saying, we would have not successfully had the antiretroviral treatment being rolled out for free in clinics and health facilities in hospitals if we didn't tackle the drug prices in terms of the pharmaceutical companies. So in as much as we're saying the state must take reasonable measures and steps to realize the access to treatment, we had to actually deal and confront the pharmaceutical companies who were playing the monopoly, in terms of access to food and setting up the price and having the right, to determine the price, to bring down the prices. So I think Dr. Chantel spoke about the importance of driving that, being so intentional about, fighting, this contamination of the food system to children and the dropping rates of infant feeding, but also tackle head on, how feeding for children has been commodified with the vigorous marketing that is actually taking, that is dropping the rates of breastfeeding down. So I think those are some of the most important things in terms of how do we tackle the economic determinants of health, because they are real. And if you look at today, people feel good and feel with high esteem if they are buying a formula milk, right, rather than breastfeeding. Even in instances in rural areas where people do not have money, and we're talking in one of the webinars with Dr. Chantel and other colleagues that, there are now measures that people can buy a spoon, of milk to feed the child at that point in time. So we are talking about the low income households, which are taking the most needed money that is mostly spent on food, because the economic determinants of health when it comes to formula to children is real. So how do we tackle the industry interference and how it's shaping public health policy, but also it's shaping the food system of children. I think it's very, very important. And I think as Healthy Living Alliance, within our food justice, we want to tackle this issue head on, and we want to invite the church, because where are the mothers and the caregivers? They are in church. And we think the church is one of the most progressive spaces in tackling the issues and building the advocacy and access to nutritious food for children. So with those few words, let me pause there so that we can have some more time. And I'm happy to actually take more comments and questions from colleagues from the two presentation, and to talk more on some of the issues that I've highlighted. Thank you so much.